Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. And as John Todd said, I gave a talk last year on reforming administrative government and federal government, and we're still working on that. My name is, again, Jim Carlson. I'm the managing partner of Stillwater Technical Solutions. We are a for-profit small consultancy that trains county commissioners on how to engage higher government using their local 9th and 10th Amendment authorities, how to engage higher government. And so that's what we do. And then we actually engage in the field, typically on administrative actions such as endangered species listings, things like that. That would be Fish and Wildlife Service, but also land use planning, etc. And we've had about 8 successes. And so, and we're just a small firm. We have a low budget, and so that's what Stillwater does. Now we've brought in Erick Kaardal, and Erick Kaardal is an attorney. He's a delightful speaker. He's going to share with you. His talk is called "Strategic Litigation Against the Government," or SLAG. And Erick was born in Redwood Falls, Minnesota. His wife is Allison. Erick and Allison have 8 children. He's now a practicing attorney out of Minneapolis, and they've filed hundreds of lawsuits. He's a name brand world-class troublemaker when it comes to litigation. And he's participated in over 200 federal, state, district, administrative court proceedings. And he's going to share with you, he's going to touch on 2 Supreme Court cases that he teed up and shepherded along. He'll share with you about that. And then maybe, hopefully, Erick will talk about some initiatives that we're working on. And our goal is, and I'll look at Erick here, I'll put him on the spot a little bit, but our objective here is to bring SLAG to Kansas. We're gonna bring SLAG to Kansas, and so next year when I come, maybe I'll report more administrative work, but maybe we'll also be able to have some favorable litigation and lawsuits on COVID and some other things. So we'll see how that works out. So with that, I'd like to introduce Erick Kaardal.
So thank you, and it is true I'm a first-class troublemaker. And in fact, the Star Tribune, the big paper in Minnesota, called me up and wanted to do a little puff piece on me. But because I make so much trouble for government officials in Minnesota, I said, well, if they're going to do a piece on me, I want it to be helpful to the cause. So I said, well, here's a list of examples of 40 cases I've won against the government. I give to the journalist. And I said, you talk to these people in the establishment, and when they tell you he's a maverick and a gadfly journalist, you give them the list of 40 cases I won, the examples, right? And all they could do then is say, well, what Erick is doing is important. But the real funny thing about the article, because I'm very much like you, I believe human identity precedes racial identity. I believe human identity really precedes everything. Everyone deserves respect and dignity. I understood that I had to have a soft approach with the press, right? And so who did I pick as my mascot? And if you look on the internet, you'll find the article. I picked Don Quixote, right? Because Don Quixote was tilting at windmills. And when you take on the task of improving government, you're going to get criticized. You're going to be criticized because everyone in the government thinks everything is fine, right? In fact, when you go into court, this is how they operate. They come into court and they say, this is what we did, Judge. Everything's fine. And what I have to do is remind the court there are 2 steps, and the courts like to be reminded of this. The first step, Judge, is to tell us what the law is. Because if our judges don't tell us what the law is, who's going to tell us? We can't rely on the government for that, right? And once the judge tells us what the law is, then is the government violating the law? That's it, right? And so if you'd imagine, I grew up in that small town of 5,000 in rural Minnesota, and I was actually one of 8 children. I ended up going to Harvard on an ROTC scholarship. I was just frightened by the left out in Boston, absolutely terrified, and just ran to the right. And then I got to University of Chicago Law School, then I got to Minnesota, and I went to Minnesota because what? I wanted to help. and I wanted to help politically. And then I was inspired by the Tea Party movement, but I knew that, well, there's energy there, but it might end up being co-opted. And I want to work on a philosophy. I want to work on something that will help everybody. And so I started with a mentor, a philosopher, and we started talking about, well, what would a philosophy of populism look like? So I tried to mention that we have a lot in common. I think we understand about loving our neighbor. We understand human identity is more important than all those other identities. So we have a lot in common. But the talk today is about why we might be a little different, if that makes sense. So I'm coming to you. You've witnessed the left totalizing, suppressing speech, suppressing people from their work, canceling each other. So I'm going to suggest something a little different because I've witnessed something different in my lawsuits against the government. So what I'm suggesting is that we need a different approach based on my experience, and I call it populism. So let's see if we go to the first slide. So a populist is concerned not only about how attorneys, but everyone does legal reading, thinking, and writing. Now that's a big topic, right? But remember, my biggest concern here is that we read pretty good. That's the good news, right? We read pretty good. When we read these laws, when we read these ordinances, these statutes, these constitutional texts, we do a good job. We give the ordinary meaning to the words. We do a good job. But when the public officials read the laws that authorize their power, they do a good job. They do exactly what we do. I mean, it's just perfect. But when it comes to the public officials reading laws that limit their powers, they forget how to read. They forget how to read, they forget how to think, they forget how to write. I was talking to a colleague of mine at work and I said, these 200 appeals we've had or whatever, I actually look at the body of work of the judges. They've done a pretty good job. But I look at the body of work of the government attorneys I've sued, it's like, what's going on? How can our government exceed these very simple limitations? An example in Minnesota was there were 10 sheriffs and 23 police chiefs who were running a driver safety school. So it was legally unauthorized, and the Minnesota has a uniform ticketing system. And so they were deviating that by saying, if you pay the tuition to go to my school, then I won't give you a ticket. And so we went into court and shut all those programs down. That's 33 law enforcement officials. And the guy that was the leader was the president of the County Sheriff's Association. And after it was done, he said, now listen to this is a law enforcement official. Even if it was illegal, it was still worthwhile. So this is your government. It's in Minnesota, in the red counties. It's in the blue counties. It's here in the red counties, and it's the blue counties. The public officials do not want to behave according to your laws. And it's very important to understand this because we want our public officials to be able to read the laws that limit their powers. If you don't teach your public officials how to read, if the court doesn't help us teach our public officials how to read the laws properly, where are we going? I mean, either the government, and this is populism, right? Either the government manages the culture or the people manage the government's culture, right? There's only two choices here. The people manage it, the people manage the government, or the government manages the people. That's populism. So let's move to the next slide here, if I can get there. So now, strategic litigation against government. This is what we want to bring to Kansas. And the Thomas More Society out of Chicago, they're an $8 million nonprofit public interest law firm. And I'm representing them, and they want to come here and do work. They want to work in the pro-family area, the religious liberty area. They're working in the elections law area, of course, the abortion area, and that's where they got their start with representing sidewalk counselors. So what is strategic litigation against government? It is strategic. It suggests multiple rounds of litigation in many and varied subject areas. In other words, with your court, and I understand you select your justices here in a very particular way. The Bar Association selects the justices for your Supreme Court, and that's created some problems for you. If you just file one lawsuit and give up, they just, it's like what would be a hen pheasant, right? You kind of try to hide it, right? But the point is that if you have lots of volume, then people will start to talk. Half my career has been spent telling liberal judges not to be illiberal, because we don't want illiberal. If we're going to have liberal judges, we have to teach them how to think more like us. In other words, we have to teach them how to read, right? Read the laws that limit the government's power. So then litigation, generally civil litigation involving legal intensive questions such as interpretation of specific legal texts. This type of litigation costs a dime if you do it right. It doesn't cost $1 because you don't go to discovery, you don't go to trial. You have to be vetted, you have to be careful, you have to make sure you have a good argument the government's exceeding the law. But guess what? It's doing it all the time. Against, yes, we're against the government, but you know what's beautiful from that common identity we have? When you beat the government in court, you've redeemed the court, and you redeem the government. It's redemption. That's the way the system works. One of the greatest things about America is our courts were originally intended to protect the people from the government. And now I know this is going to be tough on everyone, because when I talk about government, I'm talking about government, right? So government means federal agencies, state agencies, regional authorities, counties, cities, school districts, watershed districts, drainage authorities, public universities, townships. You probably have some friends that work for the government. But I can tell you, after doing this for 30 years and telling everyone in the world that will listen to me, I've made a career out of suing the government, that even the government officials begin to see the problem. Like one time I spoke at a school district, there's some bond referendum that was kind of a stupid one. I was talking to the school district, and there was a guy kind of skulking in the back. There were like 50 people there, and I couldn't figure out what he was doing. And then eventually, after it was all over and everyone left, he came up to me and said, "Oh, Eric, I've been a custodian here for 30 years, and it's much worse than you're stating." Those are the things that keep me going. When government officials turn on the government and start being whistleblowers, that's a sign. When county attorneys start saying to their county boards, "Look, if you do this, someone's going to sue you because you're exceeding your authority." So this is possible in Kansas, to start bringing lawsuits, to start showing that your establishment government here is running roughshod over these limitations. And people are being injured. What is SLAG not? And it's very important what we're omitting. We're not trying to reform the judicial system. We're not trying to reform the legal system. And it's not a complete solution to our governmental problems. We still need a broad movement of people saying, limiting government through establishing more limitations, ordinances, statutes. You need people reforming the judicial system we've discussed. The judicial selection process seems like it's really weak. And so if we work on those things, we can have the lawsuits be a part of that. So what does this offer Kansas? Well, the first and most important thing is I'm offering you more democracy. So a litigation is an option. It's a tool in your toolbox. You can write letters, you can go to hearings, you can draft ordinances, you can run for office, you can do all these things. But you need to have this other tool, and that is suing the government when it exceeds its authority. And it's really important, because these agencies as well, if they can't get what they want for the legislature, these blue agencies, they'll do it through the rulemaking process. So you have to be watching them all the time. It's like we all have to be watchdogs at every level of the government. With respect to the rule of law, this is a thing that unites us with respect to whether you call it democracy or republic. We need rule of law. The other side has lost that. And so we're now accountable for reinserting the rule of law in our government. It almost seems like the left has totalized. They're in a state of totalization. They figured everything out, and so they want to run everything. And so what we have to do is say, well, look, you can run everything, but you can't exceed the law. You can't exceed your power, and the courts are here to protect us from that. And again, the point of populism is, can the people manage the government and not allow the government to manage the people? And it's really bad. I'm going to give you a quick testimony here with respect to public schools, really fast. But the one public school I'm working with, it's a town of like 10,000 people in rural America, and the principal in 8th grade, in the middle school, put up non-European flags and a gay pride flag, which may be typical even in a public school here in Wichita, but that means what's omitted are European flags and other flags, right, like a straight flag or Christian flag or whatever. And so initially I was brought in because, this is outrageous, this display. But when I did the research, what really was outrageous is that there was no counter speech allowed by either the employees or the students. So if you were an employee and you were criticizing the flag, then the principal called you in and reprimanded you for criticizing display for not having European flags or the gay flag, the pride flag. And then the other part of it was that the students then were disciplined as bullies. So remember, this isn't a parent's kitchen. Who are your ancestors? Can you be proud to be Irish anymore? Can you be proud to be German? And then secondly, marriage. So you're teaching your child marriage is for a lifetime, and you're teaching your child to be proud of their, let's say, European ancestry, and then they're being disciplined at school in that context where the school initiated controversy, right? And so they're really in this position where they're trying to indoctrinate the children. Some of the more conservative faculty members in the emails I received said, well, this is just indoctrination to ban all counter speech. So we're bringing a parental rights claim, we're bringing free speech claims. That's the example of where they're going. And so we have to fight back because this is basically the end. So when you're working on SLAG, what we need in Kansas we need a bunch of populists working to improve government in different specific subject areas. Now, so if you're meeting someone who's improving the government, in a subject area, and there are 100 governments in everything, right? So you probably have like 1,000 subject areas in Kansas the government's working in, and you find someone, many of you in this room are already doing it, and you say, well, look, I know you're hot on this subject area. Let's say it's land use controls, and someone over here is hot on judicial selection reform. Someone over here is concerned about administrative agency law. Someone over here is concerned about natural resources. And all these people who are on our side haven't been working together. So when I'm talking about the populism, I'm really not trying to convince you to abandon anything that you've already believed. What I'm basically saying is you got to start looking outside your vineyard and seeing that other people are doing similar things that you're doing and encourage them. So when I met Jim and I saw that what he was doing, I was like, wow, Jim, you're taking on the federal government and the state government on public lands projects, representing counties and ranchers and farmers, and whoa, I mean, that's amazing. But basically, it's what I'm doing. I mean, I'm saying that, look, in every subject area, the government can be improved. And part of that is people getting engaged to improve the performance of the government, and part of that is filing lawsuits, because we know the left doesn't care about the limitations on government. Why would they? They've totalized. They're Machiavellian. The ends justify the means. And so we're being reactive. So there isn't a chance anymore for conservatives to sit on their hands and say, look, I'm for good government. No, it's falling apart much more quickly than that. And so we have to take a new attitude, and it's an attitude in part of reaction. When they're rolling out the big program, they shouldn't get the benefit of the doubt. Whatever that big program is in the public schools, the land management area, or whatever. So the philosophy, the populist bumper sticker is the American people surviving oppressive government for more than 200 years. Now I know that those people who want to quote the Constitution aren't going to be completely happy with that. But the point is, that was the spirit of the Constitution. The spirit of the Constitution was, we don't want an oppressive government. That's the spirit. These people knew that the government can oppress, and so we have to figure out how do we improve the performance of the government so it doesn't become any more oppressive than it is. And I'm an optimist. That's why I'm here. I'm an optimist. I'm not saying give up. I'm saying use the democratic means available to improve government performance in every subject area, gain every ally you can in every one of those subject areas, and build a movement across subject areas, and you'll do great things for Kansas. To me, that's like loving your neighbor. And so when I worked with my philosopher friend, we've written a couple books together, but what I said was, we have to love our neighbors. And it has to be about politics because, it's mano a mano. It's you're taking my money to help the other person. And so it's restricted. So how do you love your neighbor in politics? Well, you improve government performance in every subject area. You do whatever you can. We got to have a better government, respects human dignity, respects, human identity. And those things can be accomplished in Kansas, but we might have to sort of change our thinking a little bit about how we approach the government. Because that's what I'm talking about today, is that it's the people versus the government. And you'll see that I'm hesitant in criticizing other people because the government's so bad. And so it's the government that's bad. The government can be improved. And that's how we're going to rebuild community with these people who have rejected liberalism, rejected democracy, but haven't agreed with us yet. You see the point? There's 20% of these people in Kansas who are voting blue actually don't feel comfortable being Democrats. They don't feel comfortable being liberals, but we have to reach out to them. This would say, we're going to reach out to you subject area by subject area. We're going to be open. You don't like gun rights? Well, how about the Century 2 project? Why don't you sign this petition in Wichita, right? And so there are so many areas where we can meet people and sort of work against the government to improve it. Whoops. Oh, and then now with respect to my philosophy of language I've been discussing, it is postmodern in a sense of, look, I understand that words are fought over. So the word marriage, boy, what a fight, huh? We just went through a huge fight. The word marriage, to me, has one definition, but when I recognize the other side has another definition, that's sort of progress in understanding how the world works. So I think it's important when you're looking at cultures, that when you're looking at cultures, like let's say you're advising someone on whether to go, native culture or go, sort of elitist culture or whatever you're talking about, that we understand that we have to be flexible. We have to be, when we go into those cultural issues, we need to be careful. We need to build community, build relationships. And the way to do that is to gain experience and knowledge and wisdom, and not only be able to point out what a culture has, but what a culture omits. So when I go in and take on the LGBTQ community, I'm taking on this case with the flag. Look, you got some good things in your culture, but you omit traditional marriage, traditional families. That's off. But you have to get in this position where you have some wisdom, knowledge, and experience to do that. But then when you're in that position, then yeah, go ahead. You can make cultural references. You can make cultural preferences. And I don't particularly have anything against the LGBTQ community, but the point is when they overreach and they're punishing kids as bullies in a public school for talking about lifelong marriage, they've gone too far. We want something between welcoming and the clubs at the high school is being used for grooming. And that's just a fact. And there are more details behind that. But let's move on. So on the common sense, ordinary language, democratic sensibilities, that's a nice way to say it. We're against experts, we're against elites, we're against everything they stand for. We want the people to move on the government, and we know the government has gotten into its position of elitism and expertism because of bad philosophy. That bad philosophy is the government manages the people. The better philosophy is the populist philosophy. The people manage the government. How do the people do that? Through laws. But when the government's misbehaving and exceeding all the limitations of its powers, what do you do, right? We're in the last days here. So on the pars destruens, pars construens, it's really important that I am up here giving you the case against the government. So that's pars destruens, right? It means I'm criticizing. That's the philosophical term. I'm criticizing the government. There's arguments, pars construens, where you make the constructive argument for the government. Do not conflate those two. It is not a day to talk about how we're going to rebuild and restore the government. Rome is burning. We need to talk about what's wrong with the government right now. So for example, in my cases, when I sue the government for misbehaving, I don't praise the government it's not time to say, oh, they're doing everything else fine. No, when you're suing the government and they've been wrong, they have to be disciplined, and that's what the court's for. And so this is, and believe me, the judges like that clear thinking. The judges like to be presented with these cases, and the judge will decide. And the judge decides, in a lot of cases, like I mentioned, that the government's in error. Because why? Because the government wasn't reading. Now, do I wish the judges were in a position to scold the government? Like, county attorney, can't you read? I wish it were that way. Now, that would be the way that if we prevail, we'll get there, right? But right now, it's like, oh, well, I guess the county attorney made his interpretation, right? Interpretation is one of those watchwords, because if you're interpreting, you're probably not reading government. And so that we watch for that. But we're going to get there. We're going to have a time when the judges will actually scold government attorneys for not following through on limitations on their powers. Then the countercultural narrative, I mean, basically the government, like I said before, they're saying the trains are running on time, and they're always running on time, and you can never say anything otherwise. And if you do, you're going to be ostracized, called a maverick or a gadfly. But it's not true. And so it's just not true. Now, in Minnesota, I've counseled people for a couple decades, and I want to counsel you here too. Don't worry about the wasteful spending until you stop the illegal spending. Because when the government's spending money illegal, that's got to be the first priority, because they're ignoring your limitations and spending the money. And again, the government throughout Kansas, it's all blue. It's even the staffs are blue in the red counties and the red cities, and you got to be watching that. So let's talk about a couple cases quickly and how Kansas can make an impact nationally. There are many Kansas cases that end up at the U.S. Supreme Court. I'm bringing up these U.S. Supreme Court cases I originated because of how they affect Kansas. So the first one is Republican Party of Minnesota v. White, and that regarded judicial elections. And there's a pro-life conservative candidate for Minnesota Supreme Court Justice who was running for office, the judicial office of Minnesota Supreme Court Justice, and he read the rules and said you can't announce your views on disputed legal and political issues. You can't announce that you're a Republican or a Democrat. You can't announce that you've been endorsed by political organizations. So the candidates running against the incumbents were completely neutered. And so the First Amendment had never been applied by the federal courts to a judicial campaign. So that case took about 10 years, and in 2002, we won 5-4 on the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, you would think that's kind of an easy one, but it was a 5-4 decision because the 5 justices in the majority, led by Antonin Scalia, said it's an election, so the First Amendment applies. Now, in the dissenting, Justice Ginsburg said, it's not an election, so the First Amendment doesn't apply. She said that judicial elections aren't like regular elections, so we can't expect First Amendment activity. So the point here is a populace believes that the judges should reflect the people's view. And so we're comfortable with judicial elections, we're comfortable with discussions with judges, we're comfortable with those sort of things. And in fact, if you look at these judicial opinions, any of you are good readers, basically understand that there's no secret legal language, there are no secrets here in the government. There's no private language that's superior to the people's language. And so our point is that we need to press on this judicial selection issue in Kansas, because you don't have a very good Supreme Court right now. You don't have a Supreme Court that reflects where the people are at. And you need to have justices that reflect who Kansas is, otherwise your government will exceed legal limitations on its power that have been enacted by your state legislature. And I've talked to your former Attorney General Phil Klein, I've talked to former Secretary of State Chris Kobach last night, and they're in agreement that you have a problem with your judiciary, that you get laws passed, and then the agencies ignore them, and then you try to litigate, and that doesn't work out either. So it's a long-term project, but remember, I'll say this the American Indian way, we're worried about the next 7 generations. Then the other case was 2018, and here Minnesota election officials were actually training election judges that if you wore conservative T-shirts or conservative apparel, you couldn't vote. And so I was like, well, that can't be right. So I wrote a letter. It was 2010. I wrote a letter to the Secretary of State thinking I just send a letter, this will all get fixed. But actually they doubled down and they made it a statewide policy. Now they kind of said, we're prohibiting political apparel. And it said, for example, Tea Party gear, and then MoveOn.org. But MoveOn.org wasn't organized in 2010. It was more like 2008, 2006. And so it was targeting the Tea Party T-shirt wearers and apparel wearers, and these kind of T-shirts were like, freedom or economic justice, or they really weren't offensive. But the election judges in Minnesota had their eyes out, and they were taking down their names for prosecution. And so then we litigated the case, and the ban was on political apparel at the polling place. And then we got all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, hadn't won in anything. And we got to the U.S. Supreme Court. And then Justice Alito was asking questions to the county attorney, and the question was, well, could you wear a T-shirt with the First Amendment on it? And the county attorney assured him, oh yes, that wouldn't be political. But how about one with the Second Amendment printed on it? Oh no, that would be political. You can't wear that at the polling place. And just like you did, the transcript reflects laughter. And Americans are so ready to mock the government because of the problems we have, that oral argument ended up getting national publicity, and an internet law journal called The Green Bag that gives out annually gifts to its subscribers put the quotes that I just read to you on a coffee mug and send it all over the nation. The point being that populism is really popular right now. And we were talking about this before Trump was elected, but as you know, Trump has welcomed the term. Well, before Trump, when I put in populism, you could barely get any entries in America, but now you can, because Trump has basically become the populist president. So so with respect to Kansas, how I'd like to apply that case is start looking at how your retention elections are working, and see if we can work through that, and maybe work with your legislatures to improve your judicial selection process. You really can't leave your children or your grandchildren with the current situation where the bar, of all things, is selecting your Supreme Court justices. I mean, the bar in every state is to the left. I mean, what do you call that, like rigged appointments? I don't even know how you get in a position to ever agree to attorneys. I mean, the saying that G.K. Chesterton said was, people go to law school to narrow their minds, not broaden them. So why would you pick narrow people to pick narrow justices, right? I mean, you'd want the people to choose the justice because you might get someone who's less narrow. All right, so that seems obvious to me. Then on doctrinal development, just as how serious this is, over time, now in foreign policy, you look at the map, the geography year to year, it doesn't change much. But if you take it every 10 years, it changes, right? I mean, Iron Curtain falls, there are other changes that go on, Czechoslovakia splits, whatever. And so in legal doctrine, that's true too. I just wanted to give you one example of the deep thinking and what's required to beat the deep state from the populist perspective. And so there are two doctrines we like. Taxpayer standing. That means any taxpayer can walk into court and say, hey, that money's being illegally spent, or that public official is acting illegally. We love taxpayer standing. That's not available in federal court, but it's available in state courts. Secondly, quo warranto is an ancient writ that used to be when someone claimed to be sheriff, and you could oust him by bringing a petition for writ of quo warranto if he wasn't actually sheriff, hasn't been officially appointed. But the quo warranto in Minnesota has developed to a point now, and it's preserved under many state constitutions as an ancient writ that existed before the state constitutions, that you can challenge an official for doing anything that's legally unauthorized. So in 2020, just a few months ago, in the Minnesota Supreme Court, which is left to center, 5 Democratic appointees, they re-blessed in the Save Lake Calhoun case quo warranto. So the combination of quo warranto and taxpayer standing means in Minnesota, any taxpayer can go into court and challenge any legally unauthorized action by a government official. Now, why did the court allow that? Because the court wants to be important, right? Who doesn't want to be important, right? And so I presented over these years a way for the court to be important, and even the left bought it, right? Because they witnessed all the transgressions, and they wanted to be involved at least in, perhaps blessing the transgressions, right? but the point is that this is what we need to do in Kansas. Now, why do you go through all this hassle? Oh, all that, because all states have sovereign immunity, and they have to express in a statute a way to sue the state. So I got tired of there not being a statute in Minnesota authorizing suing the government in every type of situation. Geez, this is crazy. I can't sue the government whenever my clients want. But if you go to this ancient writ, quo warranto, that existed before the state constitution is expressly preserved, then you have a common law writ to challenge the government when it's exceeding its authority that a taxpayer can bring. Now, everyone thinks about civil rights, right? Well, civil rights are important, don't get me wrong, but this is more important because civil rights, that's just for violating federal law. This is about violating any law. So we got a writ of quo warranto against the Secretary of State in Minnesota for going with online voter registration without statutory authority. I mean, how cool is that you can just, like, as a taxpayer, go in and say, you can't do that, you don't have authority. And then the idea is then to have a populist community vetting these cases, vetting these ideas, and then you would bring the lawsuits when appropriate. And it's kind of crazy how underutilized the procedures are. In Kansas, you can challenge administrative rules. You can do all sorts of appeals when decisions that directly affect you. And they're just not being utilized by the community here. So when the government gets out of control, you got to go back to the law book and figure out how you can fight it. Now, some of those things, you can do pro se. I've counseled people pro se. I remember one case where Minnesota passed 2 contradictory laws in the same session. One saying if the passengers are wearing a seatbelt, not wearing a seatbelt is crime, and the other one said it wasn't a crime. They directly conflicted. One way, and so I advised people pro se, and eventually it went to the Court of Appeals, and they cleaned it up. But it's really interesting how you can help people if you're willing to be open to that. And again, get that common identity we have. We're all here because we want to help our neighbor. We want to make government better. And so that's the way to do it. So the summary is that Kansas strategic litigation against government is not trying to solve the world's problems, but we're trying to make a contribution. I mean, G.K. Chesterton, another quote from him, he has that one, the only view of heaven we have here on earth is fighting a losing battle and not losing. So when you get into populism, it's this endless battle against the government, but it's worth it because we're fighting for freedom, we're fighting for liberty, we're fighting for limitations on government power. And I tell you, one of the things, I've got a case that's going to, I think I'll go to the U.S. Supreme Court, but I took on child protection services for unnecessary home placements. And what I did, rather than jumping in with my own views on family, I adopted their view. And when I adopted their view as single parents or grandparents or uncles and aunts raising these children, and that they're living through these threats of child protection service coming in for what we would view as ordinary parenting. I mean, in Minnesota, they can seize kids under the child abuse definition for CPS civil seizures, child protection service civil procedures, for ordinary parenting, ordinary parental discipline, yelling at the kid, and it's all just there. And what does the government attorney do when we go to court? They just lie about what the law means. And so I'm there. I mean, we've been through this like 2 years now, and they say, no, we would never seize a child when it's not necessary. And when we filed that lawsuit, Dwight Mitchell is my African-American client, and I got over 1,000 phone calls from single parents just wailing and crying because of unnecessary out-of-home placements. Now, sure, some of them are probably ones that should have lost. But when you have unconstitutional procedures and racial disparities, stop it. You can't do that. You can't do that to these people who are raising these children. It's not their fault necessarily. They're in that situation raising that child. But to have CPS hovering over you, and do you think when CPS is doing that up in Minnesota for decades, that is seizing children based on parental discipline, that doesn't affect those children and how they view the world? And you don't think those are the kids that are rioting up there? I mean, we need to teach the government what parenting is. And you know, we've lost even that. So we can't talk about our ancestry in public schools. We can't talk about the value of long marriages in public schools. And we can't even parent. You see how you're losing those fundamental rights? I mean, eventually, like you're playing basketball, you start taking out rules like you can't dribble, you can't shoot, you can't pass. Well, eventually it's not basketball, right? And in a family, if you can't talk about your ancestry, can't talk about how great marriage is, you can't talk about these other things, it's not family anymore. The government is distorting family. And then the family issue is a good one culturally, because I found out that I cannot say anything that can be interpreted to condemn any family, any form, because I have to be so careful, right? So I can say, you know, mobility of children is a problem, mobility of boyfriends is a problem, you get what I'm saying? I can say that we've lost the art of conversation about family. We can say that aunts and uncles used to be more involved in family. But if I want to have those single parents, those single people raising those children on my side, I'm not going to condemn them. But you know what? I'm going to condemn the government for a policy that distorts family every day, because that's wrong. It's wrong to take a child away from their only adult caregiver, whoever it is. And so I want to say that those are things that we haven't been talking about as conservatives as much, Republicans, but we need to get engaged because, and that's a good one. You know why Child Protection Services has the unnecessary out-of-home placements? It's just like Sheriff Barsh, I started my talk. Even if it's unconstitutional, it's still worthwhile. There's federal funding involved. So in your red counties, every kid the CPS grabs, they get more money. You get enough kids, then you end up having another job. So if anyone knows about that, I'd love to start that case now down here. Anyway, then we're not anti-government. You got to remember, when we win, we're redeeming the government. Everyone's going to say, oh, you're crazy anti-government. No, you're not. I mean, I'm your neighbor, and I just want better government. And then finally, we need to figure out a way to effectively challenge the government. Otherwise, the government's just going to run our lives. Thank you so much. Oh, thank you.
So we'll do the questions now, Pachyderm questions first. Please keep it a question, not a statement.
Yes, I recently attempted to buy a gun and was stopped temporarily by the arbitrary and capricious decision of the FFL, who's not even a government official. That it has been shoved down from the top to the bottom to leave this guy all the power in the world to stop you from getting one, but not to increase your chances. And I find that to be reprehensible. I find that to be, I don't know. I mean, what do you think about that? Is there a case there?
Yeah, I think that the gun rights issues are very important. I think that that's a great example of, if you have an organized populist group in the gun rights area that's been working for decades, you're protected in the United States. If you don't, you've lost your rights. It's a very discrete, very specific area of administrative law, the conceal and carry permits. Minnesota has an exemplary group. They've been working for 30 years, and they have some of the best conceal and carry laws in the country. And so you're right that there are constitutional issues involved, but as a practical matter, you need to get the good conceal and carry laws in, get thousands and thousands and thousands of people trained with conceal and carry permits, and then point them and say, you know, they're a better group than the rest of the population. They don't get arrested, they don't go to jail, they pay their taxes, blah, blah, blah. And so you're right that there are these problems about arbitrary and capricious behavior, but that's an area where people in Kansas who generally favor gun rights can take the state legislature, take the administrative bodies, and tell them this is the way it's going to work. And so that would be the vision. But in the particular case, you may have had your rights violated, absolutely.
My wife and I have two of our great-grandchildren living with us. One is 8 and one is 5. About a week and a half ago, the 8-year-old did something that was wrong. My wife was correcting him, and he decided he didn't want to listen to what she was saying to him, and so he turned to walk away from her. So she reached out and took him by the arm and pulled him back. Well, somehow he has a bruise on his arm. Whether it's from her touching him or other activities, I don't know. Anyway, we got a visit from a social worker looking into possible child abuse because of this incident. Now, is this crazy or what?
Right. So here's the deal. A lot of you are parents, and all of you have parents, right? So the deal, not only is it crazy, but it's the law. And so what happens in states is that because the public schools have to maintain order, the laws will say that the public school teachers can use reasonable force to correct a child. And in private school, you might be able to use reasonable force to correct a child in corporal punishment. But for CPS, if you do either of those, that's grounds for taking the child. So you're in danger. I mean, you're being investigated. And if they determine that it was child abuse under the vague definition, you could lose that child. And there's nothing worse for a child, unless there's real child abuse, right? The real child abuse, like injury, than being removed from a home. But the court systems do not allow that to be considered in the process. So when you go on the CPS, you're challenging CPS, the judge says, well, you can't talk about the pain and suffering of the child being removed from the home. That's not part of this process. And to our tradition, where we're coming from, where human identity is most important, the mother is the most important, the father is the most important. I mean, that's nuts. Like you said, crazy, right? It's absolutely crazy. I can't believe that happened to you. But imagine then, these single parents or single caregivers, low income, maybe they're working and taking care of the kid, and just the fear of CPS showing up, they're not using discipline. I mean, I've talked to them. They're not, because they think that if it happens. One story quickly, there was a big 17-year-old and a little mom, and my client Dwight Mitchell heard them talking about, why'd you make me come here? Well, you took my iPhone away. CPS is being used by so many different sort of vantage points, public employee unions, counties trying to get more jobs, whatever. And I think we need to work on that. I mean, there's too many CPS workers, and the reason is the federal funding. If Kansas was left to its own devices, you wouldn't have half the problems.
Sir, you have to work so hard to get change. Shouldn't we, the people, the government, be working harder to elect those officials, senators, representatives, Supreme Court, that work that problem internally in the big houses there in Washington?
Well, that's right. So what happens is that, in Minnesota, because the litigation strategy is so now embedded in the populist movement up there, that the state legislators, it's really funny, because there's like 10 state legislators over there, or maybe 20 actually, who are so frustrated with the system that whenever I file a lawsuit, they offer to do a press conference for me. So can you imagine? So nothing's happening over here, but something's happening over here, and they're seeing the courts move a little bit, and so the state legislators are understanding, I need those lawsuits to help move my agenda. Now, we're about 40 years late, right? Because the left has been doing this for a long time. So I'm coming to you, and I'm just basically saying that we have to start using the tactics of the left in order to beat them. But I think the left has gone so far that we're really in a good position.
Thank you for being here. Stephen Owens, State Representative for the 74th. Please sue us. The fact of the matter is, our executive office has far exceeded their constitutional authority. And it's blatant in every way, shape, or form, from closing businesses, religion, so many different things, that it takes an organization that's willing to do that. And yes, I'll be happy to help with that press conference for you. Now, my actual question. Citizens grand jury, have you read about that in our state constitution, and does that play in anywhere as it pertains to getting our government in check?
Well, no, I think that's right. I have read the Kansas Constitution, and there's a lot to work with, and part of the problem is a lot of it's been ignored. And you kind of want to say it's the lawyer's fault and it's the judge's fault, but it's the people's fault too, because again, with these ancient writs and the legislatively enacted private causes of action to sue the government we already have, we can already be doing a lot of things. And a lot of this is convincing the people that it's worth it. So when you get elected to the state legislature, you need more oomph from the people. You get elected, but you need to be, catapulted into office with the movement, and a populist movement is a way to do it. And I think that when we start gaming it out, like how do we address the overreaching state agencies, the counties, the governor's office, I mean, it gets actually to be exciting. Now, what I want to say is that the populism you see every time that there's been major change to a government, like moving from colonial rule to home rule, there's always been decades of populism. There's always people saying, we can do better, we can do better. When there are these peaceful revolutions, think about like Czechoslovakia. The Czech Republic wanted independence, the Slovak Republic wanted independence. The federal government could have fought. They could have crushed the people, right? But they said, you want to live separately? That's fine. That's moral, right? Now, what happens in these situations when you're suing the government, you're fighting like you are in the state legislature, then naturally the governor is going to say things like treason, traitor, maverick, gadfly. That's just the story. Whenever there's a moral revolution like in Czechoslovakia, the people pushing for revolution are always called traitors and treason. I mean, George III, King George III called our founders traitors, right? So that's just part of it. And so that's where we're at. They're not dialoguing with us. The liberal governor here, she doesn't care what you think. She's got her program. And so we have to do what we can do to fight back. But the Democratic Party here in Kansas is overperforming. It's horrific. And we can do better if we do these things. We can do better in those elections. But we have to do the things to gain the trust of those people in the middle. And part of that is showing that the establishment here is bad, right? And we'll get there. So thanks for your service. It's really important. And I'm going to call you up on that press conference because we got a lawsuit coming.
Thanks again for being here. You said these kinds of, this kind of litigation can be out for a dime, but be a little more elaborate about what these kinds of things actually cost to run through the courts.
Right. When I started, I realized that I couldn't bring lawsuits if they were expensive. So part of it is understanding these different private causes of action, costs of appeals, and so forth. So one way that I was able to challenge, for example, Minnesota's criminalization of political speech, there are all sorts of penalties, is I realized that a certain type of lawsuit was too expensive. So rather I found an administrative lawsuit that cost like a fraction of the cost. So a lot of it is, how do you get to a decision maker in the judicial system cheaply? And so it's searching that out. And it's not like, it's different than saying, oh, what case does the government pay attorney's fees if you win? So there are a lot of civil rights attorneys out there who they're just looking for that. It's really crazy, but when I was talking about taxpayer and the petition for writ of quo warranto, God, I mean, I don't think it can get any cheaper, man. I mean, you file, you get a taxpayer, you call them on the phone. Oh, you're a taxpayer and you're mad about what the Secretary of State's doing? He's using taxpayer dollars to go with online voter registration without legal authority. Well, okay, we'll file the petition in one hearing and we'll see what the district court judge says. So that's what we're talking about. And now, do you get to do every case? I mean, when it's heavy in science or water law or whatever, then it gets really expensive. But there's a group, Edgar County Watchdogs in Illinois, and they're non-lawyers, and they just catch local officials violating the law, illegal meetings, illegal notices, and so forth. And they claim that they've caused over 100 local employees to quit because when they're actually required to follow the law, they won't do it. So you can call them up, Edgar County Watchdogs, I think they're called, and that's what we're talking about, is can we find low-cost ways to be effective? And there isn't any silver bullet here. For me particularly, I've got 8 children. I'm going to be working for a while.
Mr. Erick Kaardal.
Thank you.